Anybody that's been to San Francisco in years past have always thought it was one of the most beautiful cities in the world, one of the most picturesque cities in the world, sitting on the bay there. And there are still parts of San Francisco that are beautiful. I'm sure you would agree.
Oh, it's still my favorite city in the world. I moved out here after college because I am in love with the city and its essence is still there. It's just a very tarnished jewel at this point.
Talk about that just in general. What has happened and why is it so tarnished? Because this has to have been philosophical and systemic from top to bottom and side to side for a city to get in this much trouble in this short a period of time.
Sure. Well, so San Francisco, it's a very progressive city. It's a city that loves freedom. It's obviously, or maybe not obviously, but I think many people know it's the home to the the gay and lesbian movement, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender movements. It's been a place of free spirits. It's very libertarian. It's also very compassionate. It's named after Saint Francis, of course, who was the saint of compassion and taking care of the poor and of nature. And the combination of those two things, those two strengths in excess leads to pathology. And so what's occurred is the coddling of people that are struggling with drug addiction, where they need tough love. They're basically being enabled in their addiction. And so the city is it's overly generous in the sense of basically providing cash, housing, and many other services to people without any requirement that they address the underlying cause of their homelessness. Over 20,000 people come to San Francisco every year as homeless individuals, the vast majority of them struggling with drug addiction and or untreated mental illness. There's ostensibly about 8,000 homeless people in the city at any given time, half of whom are on the streets. And so we've seen a threefold higher overdose rate in San Francisco from drugs, threefold higher than in the United States as a whole or in California. And that's all a consequence of the refusal of San Francisco's leaders to require people to take responsibility for their behaviors, including not defecating in public, not using drugs in public, not camping in public. And many basic laws have stopped being enforced. And so that's what's the fundamental dynamic that's led to the destruction of the city.
Look, go back to Psychology 101. One of the things that we know is you just don't reward bad behavior. Go back to Skinner, go back to the most fundamental behaviorist, whether you're in a rat lab, whether you're dealing with animals, whether you're dealing with humans, the behavior you want to see repeated, you reinforce. The behavior you want to see extinguished, you either punish or withhold reinforcement. Seriously, the first week of Psychology 101, that's one of the principles that you learn, and it holds true across species, across ages within the human race. But it seems like this has been forgotten because it appears that there are certain parts within the political spectrum that believe that if you reinforce certain behaviors, that somehow they will miraculously feel a bond of brotherhood and will just stop their self-destructive behaviors. I don't get it. I'm confused. I don't understand how that is supposed to work. But what you're describing to me sounds like enabling in its most fundamental form. And enabling, that term gets used so much, I think it loses its meaning. It means making it easier or paving the way for someone to continue to do self-destructive behaviors, either giving them money for drugs, giving them housing, protecting them from prosecution, doing anything that you do that makes it possible for them to continue to do what they're doing.
That's right. In fact, you may be interested to know, or you may remember from San Francisco that the turn against having consequences for destructive behaviors, including self-destructive behaviors, The argument against that came from a psychologist, a radical left psychologist in the late 60s who wrote a very famous book called Blaming the Victim. And what he argued was that simply enforcing laws in many cases, or having a work requirement for welfare, or other responsibilities imposed, required of groups that had been historically discriminated against, was unjust. And that's where it comes from. And so it starts with basically, basically incentivizing people not to work with welfare. That was obviously changed decades later, but the argument in defense of that policy was that it was kind of making amends for the injustices that were done to African Americans for centuries in the United States. And it's very powerful because all of us, I think, most people do feel bad about the history of the United States towards African Americans, and we feel guilty. And I think that guilt is very easy to manipulate and make people feel guilty if they then are asking for, say, equal justice under the law. It then goes further and gets what gets added on to that white guilt is, I think, the pleasure of caring. And I think we tend to think of caring for others as a selfless act, but we know that we feel good caring, and that's really great. We should feel good caring for others. But I think we've all seen in our own lives, certainly I've seen it depicted on Hollywood movies, most famously Misery with Kathy Bates, adapted from the Stephen King novel, where people can be pathological in their desire to care so much that they actually end up hurting people, either in order to care or to be able to keep caring. And so I think that there's some self-indulgence here, in addition to the guilt, which is, I think San Franciscans, we feel, it's a very wealthy city. It's a very liberal city. It's powerful people. They had a very good record during the AIDS epidemic in the 80s in particular of welcoming people with HIV/AIDS from around the country into San Francisco and treating them. And it was an incredibly positive contribution. And I think that when that bled into then taking care of addicts, what got missed or what was run over in this desire to care was the fact that enabling addiction worsens the addiction. It actually makes people sicker than they would be otherwise.
Well, I don't see that there's any other possible outcome. Clearly, you have to have empathy. Clearly, you have to have compassion. But I've worked a lot with rehabilitation, and I'm not talking about drug rehabilitation. I'm talking about those that have suffered closed head injuries or just physical injuries on the job or car accidents or whatever. And one of the things that we have learned in working with quadriplegics, paraplegics, or those with just severe injuries that have to re-educate their body is that in order to get better, you absolutely must require the patient to do 100% of what they're capable of doing at every step of the process, or they never get to the next level. So if a paraplegic can get 8 or 9 feet across the room to flip a light switch themselves, and you could go over and do it for them and just let them sit there, it would be much easier. And you'd think, oh, they're so tired, I want to do this for them. But if you do that, you cheat them out of two things. Number one, you cheat them out of going through the muscle movements and creating the muscle memories of doing that. And number two, you cheat them out of the opportunity to observe themselves mastering that and increasing their self-worth and self-esteem because they saw themselves do it. It seems to me that what's happening here when we don't require these drug addicts or these people that are living a compromised life to do everything they possibly can do to get back to becoming a contributing member of society each and every day, we're cheating them out of both of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of my favorite examples from nature is if you try to help a baby chick to get out of the egg, then the baby chick will die because the chick doesn't have a chance to build up the neck muscles that are built up while cracking the egg. We see that in the case of homelessness in San Francisco. We used to require that people not camp in tents on the sidewalk and sleep in the shelter. Well, the demand from radical progressives was that people should be allowed to sleep on the sidewalk. We used to say you can't be drunk or intoxicated in public. We then say it's okay. We used to say you can't shoot drugs in public. Then they say, well, it's okay. When my first research foray with a homeless service provider, the provider was telling me quite proudly that they had done research with the homeless that they were working with. And what the homeless told them is that they wanted the service providers to bring food and clothing to them. They didn't want to have to go to a service center. They didn't want to have to walk a few blocks away. They wanted these things brought to their tents. So you get a very dystopian perspective. This culminates in COVID, where you basically have the city turning over a very large parking area in front of the San Francisco City Hall and the library with people in tents who would only get out occasionally to shower, but they would also have food brought to them. And they would basically only get up to get their drugs and go back to the tents. And so you're basically creating atrophy. You're creating addicts who are becoming atrophied vegetables because of their chronic methamphetamine and fentanyl use in particular. The two drugs have swamped most of the other drugs and are often being used in combination. So yeah, it's exactly what you described, Dr. Phil. It's been a gradual process. You can sort of trace it, as I've done in San Francisco, over the decades. But ultimately, you get to a place where basically we've turned people that would otherwise be normally functioning adults into babies.